Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's session, we will go through the process of creating a Kubernetes cluster on the AWS platform by making use of the Kops tool. So we know that Kubernetes is one of your containerization tool that we have like Docker. We can use Kubernetes as well to create our containers and then basically containerize our applications running microservices. All those things can be done by making use of your Kubernetes. Now in this particular session, we'll be setting up a simple cluster on the AWS platform, and then we'll be using this tool called Kops. So here is what we will be doing. We will launch an EC2 instance first. On that EC2 instance, we'll be installing our tool called Kops. So we need to have this Kops running somewhere. So for that purpose, we'll be using your EC2 instance. And then using this Kops, we will create our Kubernetes cluster. So we'll have one control plane machine, and then we'll have one node machine. So we'll basically have two machines. So it's a two machine cluster. You can have multiple machines, but for this example, we are going with two machines only. And then we'll install another tool called kubectl. Now, kubectl is a command line tool that allows us to interact with the Kubernetes cluster. Once our cluster is ready, we will create a pod on it. So we'll containerize a Tomcat application and we'll run that as a pod. And then we'll create a service which will allow us to access that Tomcat application. So the containerized application that we have deployed as a pod, to access that, we'll need to create a service. So this is what we will be doing. Once again, before I start off with the session, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now, before I start off with the hands-on, I want to talk a bit more about each of these components that we have so that we understand what are the different components that we are using. So the first component we are using here is the Kops. Now, Kops, it stands for Kubernetes Operations, and it's an open source project which allows us to create our Kubernetes cluster. So we can use this tool to create, destroy, upgrade, and also maintain a highly available production grade Kubernetes cluster. So we have lots of options. We have kubeadm, we can use EKS, AKS. There are lots of options that are available. Kops is one such option which can be used to set up our Kubernetes cluster. Then we have the kubectl. Now, once we're done creating the cluster, we need to interact with the cluster. So that's where kubectl comes in. So kubectl is your Kubernetes command line tool, and this allows us to communicate between the Kubernetes API and the control plane. So you want to create a pod, you want to create a deployment. So any resources that you want to create on the cluster will make use of your kubectl tool. So this tool will allow us for deploying our application, managing the cluster resources, resource monitoring. All those things can be done by making use of the kubectl tool. Then we are using an EC2 instance. So this is where we will be installing our Kops and kubectl. So EC2 instance is simply a virtual service, a virtual server that we will be running on the AWS cloud. So with this, we can request and provision a compute server within the AWS cloud. So it is simply a virtual server that we are running. Then we have your cluster. So using the Kops tool, you'll be creating your cluster. So this cluster is simply your grouping of machines, the node machines, which can be used to containerize your applications. And we can containerize them in an efficient, automated, distributed, and also scalable manner. So this cluster, it allows us to orchestrate and monitor our containers across multiple physical machines, virtual machines, as well as your cloud servers. And then we have your pod. So once our cluster is ready, we will be creating our pod. Now, pod is the smallest unit that we have in the Kubernetes. So this is what we will be using to run our containers. So any given pod can be composed of multiple tightly coupled containers or even just a single container. So within a pod, you can have multiple containers or even one single container. And then the last component we have is a service. Now, to access the web application that you're running inside this pod, if you want to expose that pod, we make use of your service. So it's a method for exposing our network application that is running inside your pods within your cluster. If you want to expose that, we make use of your service. So these are the different things that we have. These are the different things that we will be using in this walkthrough process. So let's get on with the hands-on. So here I have the GitHub repo Kubernetes_Kops. I'll be sharing the link to this in the description section. Now here I have a couple of files. One is setting up the cluster using Kops for non-EC2 instances. So if you're not using EC2 instances, that's fine. You just have to follow these instructions. So you need to have a machine first, okay? So you need to install Kops, update the machine, install the CLI, AWS CLI tool, create an IAM user in AWS. Recommended would be to give admin access. Then generate the access key and secret key for that user, and then log into AWS using that credentials. You will need to create an S3 bucket. You will need to have a domain. So once you have the domain, you'll also need to create a hosted zone. Add the NS records to your domain registrar. In my case, I'm using Hostinger, so that's why I have this step to add the NS records. We are installing kubectl tool, generating the SSH keys, and then finally we are creating our Kubernetes cluster. Now, if you're using EC2 instance, then you can follow these instructions, which is the other file I have. Now, more or less both are same. The difference you would see is that we will be launching an EC2 instance. We'll be creating an IAM role. So instead of the IAM user, we will be creating the IAM role, which will give the necessary permissions. And the rest of the steps would remain the same for us. And then I have the pod and the service, which we will be creating once the cluster is ready. So let's get started with this. The first step we have is to launch an EC2 instance, and you can launch an instance with T2.micro. That should be sufficient. So let me go to my instances and we'll begin launching a new instance. So this is going to be my Kops node. So this is where we will be installing our Kops as well as the kubectl tool, which will allow us to interact with our cluster. And like I said, T2.micro should be sufficient for this. So let's give it a few seconds, and my server should be up and running in few seconds. Let's wait for the server to come up. In the meantime, we can go ahead and do the other things, like creating a role, S3 buckets and all. Now what, let's follow the sequence. So let's wait for the instance to come up. So I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, so my instance is up and running. So we'll quickly connect to this instance. So I will do a SSH into this instance. Okay, and I should be able to log into that instance. So here I have my instance. Now, the first thing we'll need to do is install our Kops. Now, Kops, like I said, that's your Kubernetes Operations tool. So you can follow this link to basically get the instructions to install our Kops. So here we have the instructions. Now what we are doing here is we're downloading the binary files. We are giving it the execute permission, and then we are moving it to the bin location within our machine, which is the EC2 instance in this case. So let's do it one by one. So first I'll download the binary files. So this should download the Kops binary files. Then we are giving it the execute permission, and then we are moving it to our binary location. I can validate whether your Kops is installed or not by just running Kops. And if you see this output, that means your Kops is installed. You can also use Kops version, which will tell you the version of tool that we have installed. Okay, so we have our Kops ready. Next, we are going to update our machines. If there are any updates, we're just gonna apply those updates on the machine. Post that, we are going to create an IAM role. So Kops is a tool, it's a third-party tool, and this will be creating some resources on the AWS platform. So it needs to have the necessary permissions to create the resources. So that's where we are creating an IAM role. So I'll go to my IAM service and I'll create a new role. So this is for AWS service, and it's going to be for EC2, and the permissions I'm giving administrator access. Let's give it a name. So let's call this as Kops role, and I will create this role. So once the role is created, you will need to attach that role to your instance. So I'll go back to my instance, select the instance, go to actions, security, modify IAM role, and you should be able to see the role here. So this should give the necessary permissions for Kops to create the resources for us. Then we'll be creating an S3 bucket. Now the S3 bucket will be used to store the cluster related information. So all the config files, the etcd and all that files will be stored within this S3 bucket. So let me call this as cube hyphen dgr upload. So that should be my S3 bucket. Okay, so this is where my Kubernetes will store, or Kops will store the cluster related information. Next, we need to create a hosted zone. So you will need to have a domain to create your cluster using Kops. Okay, now I already have a domain, so I have used Hostinger to register my domains. I already have this domain called dgrtechies.in. All right, so you'll need to have a domain to begin with this. I can also use Route 53 to register your domains, but the point is you will need to have a domain. Now, if you're using Route 53 to raise your domains, you don't have to worry about step 6 and step 7, because Route 53 will automatically create your hosted zones and you'll have the NS records. But if you're not using Route 53, if you're using any other domain registrar like Hostinger in this case, then you will need to do step 6 and step 7. Now, to save some time, I have already created a hosted zone. So it's pretty straightforward. You go to create hosted zone, give your domain name, like in this case, dgrtechies.in. And then it's going to be a public hosted zone, and then click on create hosted zone. And that should create the hosted zone for us with the respective records. All right. I don't need that. I had created it for some testing purpose. So you should be able to see this. And then you will need to take this NS records and you will need to add it to your domain registrar. So in this case, I've already done that. I've done that to save some time, because updating these NS records, the delegations takes some time. Sometimes it takes few hours. So just to save some time, I've already went ahead and updated these NS records. Okay. The next step would be to install our kubectl tool. So kubectl will be the command line tool that we will be using to interact with our cluster. So first, we will download the binaries. So here I should have the kubectl binaries. Then I'm going to run this command, which will install the tool for us. Okay, and then you can validate whether your kubectl tool is installed or not by running this command. You can also simply run kubectl, and if you see this, that means your tool is installed. Okay, so we have installed Kops, we have installed kubectl. The next step would be to generate our SSH keys. Okay, so I will run this, which will generate the SSH keys for us. And the last step we have is to create our cluster. So here, this will be the command. So we are using Kops to create a cluster. We are giving it a name. We are giving the S3 bucket where the cluster related files needs to be stored. We are giving the availability zone where you want the resources to be created, how many node machines you want, and what is the size of the node machine. So we are going with one machine, and we are going with t2.micro, and we are going with one control plane machine. The size of it would be t2.medium, and then your hosted zone name. So this is the hosted zone. So you'll need to provide all these details. So I'll take that and I will run that on the server, and this will begin creating the cluster for us. All right. So okay, so looks like I might have a typo in my bucket name. So let me check. QDGR. Okay, so there's a typo. Sorry about that. So this would be so there's a typo in my bucket name. So let me quickly update that. So this will show me a preview of all resources that Kops will be creating for me. So it will create everything needed as part of this cluster creation. So starting from your VPC to auto scaling groups to your subnets, your IAM roles, your EBS volume. So everything will be taken care by the tool itself. So it will create everything. It will add your records in your hosted zone. So all those things will be taken care by the Kops tool itself. So here you get to see a preview of all the resources that Kops will be creating for us. There's security groups being created, Then I should be able to see all the rules. There's my VPC creations. Once you're okay with this, you'll have to like give a confirmation telling that go ahead and create these resources. So here at the bottom, you can see this command. You will need to run that, so which is Kops update cluster, the name of the cluster, and then run it as an admin. You'll also need to provide the bucket name. So hyphen state equals to sc colon slash slash the name of the bucket that you have. Okay, so you'll need to provide that. If you don't provide that, it will throw you an error telling that hey, please provide the state where the cluster related information is available. So once you run this command, it will start creating the resources. So all the resources that we saw above, all those resources will start creating, and this will take about 5 to 10 minutes. So you can see here cluster is starting and it should be ready in few minutes. So it will take few minutes for the cluster to be ready, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I'm gonna pause the video here and then I'll start the video again once the cluster is ready. So I gave about 10 minutes for the cluster to create, and now we can validate if our cluster is ready or not. So let's run this kubectl get clusters, and I'll also need to specify the bucket. So hyphen state equals to, let me give the bucket name. So this would be the format. So the bucket that we have created is this bucket. So let me give this. So this is the cluster we have created. We have created in AWS, and this is the availability zone, and we can validate this. So I can say Kops validate cluster, and then I can give the bucket name, and this should validate my cluster. Okay, so I have two machines. This is one machine, this is the other machine, and you can see the cluster is ready. And this would have created all the resources in the console for us. So if you look at your instances, I should be able to see two instances. One would be my control plane, and the other is the node machine. So we've created one node machine and one control plane. We have created your S3 bucket. So here you should be able to see all the cluster related files. So the configuration files, everything related to your cluster will be available here. And it would have also updated your hosted zones with some entries. It will also create a VPC. So basically, all the resources that my cluster requires has been created here, right? So if I go to VPCs, so here you can see this is the VPC that is created. So basically everything that is needed as part of the cluster is now available for us. So now our cluster is ready and we can start interacting with the cluster. So kubectl get nodes, and I should be able to see two nodes, right? So this is my control machine, sorry, the node machine, and this is my control machine, the control plane. Now that our cluster is ready, we can start creating a pod, and then we can create our service. So this is what I'll be using for my pod. So let me explain this as well. So we're creating a file here, pom.yml, sorry, pod.yml, and this is my instruction. So we are creating a kind is going to be a pod, which is nothing but your resource. We are creating a pod. This is my metadata. So we are giving it a name, we are adding it a label, which is your key value pair, and then we are giving the specification for the containers that we want to run. So I'm running one container. This is the name of the container we are giving, and what image you want to use for this container. Again, your Kubernetes by default looks in Docker Hub for your images. So in my case, if I go to my Docker Hub, I'm using this image, dj uploads / tomcat -image. So basically, I already have an image that I am using. So here, this is the image that I am using. So you can also use the same image if you want, or if you have your own custom image, you can also use that as well. And then we are doing the, I mean, what port numbers you want to expose or you want to use. So we are giving it a name, and because this is a Java application, we are going to run this on port 8080. So this becomes my pod specification. I'll save this file and I will run this. So kubectl create -f pod.yaml, and this should create a pod for us. So kubectl get pods. I should be able to see that my pod, it is currently in the container creating status, And if you want to look at the events of this, we can do that. So kubectl describe pod and the pod name, and you should be able to see the details of it. So what is the name, the namespace, on which node this is running, when this was started, your labels, container information, and you should be able to see the events as well. So pulling image, and if I run this once again, you can see started container. So now the container should be up and running. So my container is now running. Now this is an application, so if you want, you can connect to this. So kubectl exec, and we'll specify the interpreter. So now I should be inside the container, and this is where I have my Tomcat setup. So the image that I'm using, I've already, it's a custom image that I've created. So this is where I have my Tomcat, and under the web apps, I should have this a sample application. So I've deployed a sample.var, which gives me the sample application. So this is what we are running inside the container. Now, for us to access this application outside the pod, we will need to create a service. So service is what will allow us to expose this pod so that we can access it from the internet. Okay, so this is the configuration. So I'll explain this as well. So service.yaml. So now we are creating a service resource, that's the name, and then we are specifying the specification. So what is the port you want to use? You're in use 8080, and then your target port. See, now you will need to kind of map your kubectl get pods, sorry, the pod.yaml and the service.yaml, right? So we want this service to be pointing to this pod, right? So that's where we are doing this. You can see this target port, Tomcat port. So that's the name we are using over here. So that's kind of, we are doing a mapping. And also you see this selector over here. We are telling that, hey, this is the pod I want you to select. So that's where we have given this, this label, if you see, right? So the selector here, that's where I'm using the label, the key value pair. So what will happen is when I create this service will map itself to this specific pod. And then the type, we are using node port. So how you want to access this service? So you have a few options. You have cluster IP, you have node port, you have load balancer. In our case, we're using node port, which is nothing but I'm telling that I'll be using the IP address of the node machine to access the service, to access the web application. So let's go ahead and create that. So kubectl create -f service.yaml, and there is my service created. So now I should have my service as well. So kubectl get pods services. Okay, so I should have to run it one at a time. So there's my pod, and then kubectl get services, and here is the service that we have created. So this is the pod, and for this pod we have created the service. Now for us to access the service, you can see here there's a port mapping that has happened. So this is what we have specified in the service, and this is what Kubernetes has given me to hit this service. So I'll need to allow this port number in my instance security group. So I'll go to the node instance security group, and we'll add a new rule to the security group. So let me add this port number, and we'll allow this from anywhere for the testing purpose, and we will save this. All right, that completes the setup. Now I will take the instance IP address, the public IP, and then colon the port number that we have, and this should show me the Tomcat. So if everything goes well, you should be able to see the Tomcat. So this is what we have, and the application that we have deployed would be /sample. So remember, I showed you inside the pod under the web apps, I had the sample.var deployed. So my path would be /sample. So I should be able to see the application that I have deployed inside that container. All right. So what we have done, we have created a pod, and then we have created a service for that. All right. So once again, we launched an EC2 instance. We installed Kops. We installed kubectl. Using Kops, we have set up a Kubernetes cluster. And then inside that cluster, we have created a pod, and then we have created a service which exposes that pod for us to access the application over the internet. All right. So that's basically the walkthrough process of creating a cluster and then deploying a sample application on the cluster and then accessing that application from the internet. Now, at any point, once you're done working with this, you can go ahead and delete the cluster if you want. For that, we'll simply use this Kops delete. You can first get the name of your cluster if you're not sure. So Kops get clusters, and then you'll need to specify the bucket name, because this is where we have our the configuration files related to the cluster stored. So that's my cluster name. So we will delete this. So Kops delete cluster, that's the name of the cluster, and this is where I have the state file stored. So I will specify that, and this will start deleting the cluster. So it will show me a preview, and then it will ask for a confirmation like, hey, you'll need to specify -- yes. And when you do that, it's a confirmation that we are giving, and Kops will go ahead and delete all the resources that were created: the VPC, the EC2 instances, the Route 53 entries, roles, security groups, auto scaling groups. Basically, all the resources that were created will be deleted. So that's basically what your Kops can do. So Kops can be used to create your Kubernetes cluster as well as manage that cluster on your AWS platform. That brings us to the end of this session. I hope you found this video insightful. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Please don't forget to leave a like. And if you have any specific comments, please leave it in the comments section. Also, please let me know if there's anything specific that you would like me to cover. Until next time, happy learning.